My name is Evelyn Monroe, and for nearly 38 years I believed I had crafted a perfect life, quiet, stable, built on tradition and unwavering commitment. I was married to Gregory, the kind of man who on the surface embodied the American dream, successful, generous, well-spoken. Together we raised 2 sons and a daughter, built a beachside house in Charleston, and became the kind of couple people admired at charity galas and church fundraisers. But let me take you back before the unraveling, before the silence in our home became deafening. Greg and I met during our junior year at the University of North Carolina. He was studying business and had a way with words that could calm storms or start them. I was pursuing education, driven by a desire to teach and nurture. Our love bloomed over coffee-fueled all-nighters and soft-spoken promises under the old sycamore tree on campus. It was pure, innocent, and I thought unshakable. Years passed in a blur of diaper changes, PTA meetings, and late-night talks over wine once the kids had gone to bed. Greg climbed the corporate ladder with speed that impressed even his toughest mentors. I meanwhile gave up my career ambitions to raise our family and keep the house running like clockwork. At first, it felt like a fair trade. He brought home the security and I kept the hearth warm. That's what love was, wasn't it? Sacrifice, balance, teamwork, or so I thought. Our youngest had just moved out, leaving our house quieter than I had anticipated. It was supposed to be our time again. Dinners for 2 beach walks at dusk, rediscovering the couple we used to be before we became parents. But something was off. Greg began working later, even on weekends. He claimed it was mergers, late clients, tight deadlines. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? This was the man who once drove 4 hours in a blizzard just to get me the blueberry pie I craved when I was pregnant. The same man who cried when he saw our daughter take her first steps. The Greg I knew had never lied to me, or so I thought. My best friend Cassandra had been in my life since high school. We bonded over debate club and our mutual disdain for cafeteria meatloaf. Over the years, she became like a sister, celebrating birthdays, holidays, even babysitting my children when Greg and I took occasional getaways. She was the one I leaned on when I noticed Greg becoming distant. "He's just stressed, Evie," she'd tell me gently, sipping her Pinot. "Men get weird about aging empty nests. Just be patient." She made me feel silly for doubting him, and she always knew the right words to make me laugh, to make me feel seen. She was part of my inner circle, my family. Looking back now, I see the moments differently. The way Greg would glance at his phone when Cassandra texted, the small smirks during our game nights when they teamed up, her sudden interest in the stock market, Greg's field. But back then, I was blind, willfully so. It started with a crumpled receipt I found in the pocket of Greg's blazer while folding laundry. It was for a luxury restaurant in Atlanta. A weekend when he had said he was at a conference in D.C., I told myself it was a client dinner. Maybe he'd forgotten to mention the change. It was innocent, it had to be, but something inside me shifted. I began noticing more little things. A new cologne he'd never worn around me, unexplained charges on our credit card from boutiques I'd never shopped at, late-night calls where he'd slip away to the porch. Still, I didn't want to believe it. Until the day I found the envelope. It was tucked behind the gardening magazines in the back of his study drawer, clearly hidden. Inside were printed photos, grainy but damning Greg. At our beach house, holding hands with someone I recognized all too well, Cassandra, her long, honey-blonde hair unmistakable, even in low resolution, the same woman who sat at my table every Sunday for brunch, laughing with my kids, complimenting my roast chicken, saying how lucky I was. I felt like the air had been ripped from my lungs. The betrayal wasn't just romantic, it was foundational. My husband, my best friend, together. At the home I had poured my savings and dreams into, every board painted by hand, every room filled with memories of our family. I didn't cry at first. I was too shocked to feel anything but numb. The next morning I made Greg his coffee like I always did. 2 sugars, no cream, and placed it on the counter. "You're going to Atlanta again this weekend?" I asked softly. He hesitated. just for a second. But it was enough. Yeah, big client pitch. I nodded and smiled. Well, have a safe trip. But inside me, something dark and quiet began to awaken. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was resolve. I waited until Greg left the house that Friday morning, his suitcase in hand, briefcase tucked under his arm tie, slightly crooked, the way it always was when he was in a rush. I watched him from the kitchen window as he pulled out of the driveway, his silver Lexus gliding down the street, like nothing was wrong, like he wasn't driving off into the arms of my best friend. The moment his taillights disappeared, I turned away from the window and walked straight into his study. It was time I opened the drawer again, the one with the envelope of photos, and this time I pulled everything out. There were receipts for spa treatments, a handwritten note on hotel stationery with Greg's unmistakable looping signature. Thank you for making me feel alive again. Gee, it wasn't addressed, but I didn't need to guess who it was meant for. Alive again, I almost laughed. I had kept him alive when he had pneumonia, nursed him back to health when his own mother barely visited. I had been his emotional anchor during the financial crash, when his firm nearly went under. I had stood beside him at funerals, business awards, every major moment of his life. But she made him feel alive. I should have cried, should have collapsed in grief, but I didn't. I felt something colder settling into my bones, something sharper. It wasn't sadness, it was the clean, sterile awareness that my life had become a lie and I needed to take back control. That night, I didn't cook dinner. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the back porch with my journal, the same one Greg had bought me on our 30th anniversary. He thought I used it to write poetry, but now I used it to document every receipt, every date, every lie. I listed the suspicious trips, cataloged the timeline. I was building a case, not for court, but for myself, for clarity. Saturday morning, I drove down to the beach house alone. Greg thought I didn't know how to turn off the alarm system. He was wrong. As I stepped inside, the scent of lavender hit me like a slap. Cassandra's perfume. It clung to the air, faint but lingering, like the echo of betrayal. I walked through each room, slowly taking in every detail. A blue scarf draped over the back of the sofa, 2 wine glasses in the sink, a strand of blonde hair curled near the bathroom faucet. I took photos, not because I needed them for proof, but because I needed to face it, to burn the illusion of their secret, away with the truth of what I was seeing. In our bedroom, the master suite Greg and I had designed together, I found her book on the nightstand, Wuthering Heights. The irony wasn't lost on me. I didn't scream, I didn't throw things. I just stood there and realized something so simple, so terrifying, they never thought I would find out. That night, I slept in the guest room. I couldn't bring myself to lie in the same bed where their betrayal had unfolded. I stared at the ceiling for hours, hearing every creak of the old house, every whisper of the ocean wind outside. It wasn't grief that kept me awake. It was strategy. By morning, I had a plan. First, I contacted my lawyer. Her name was Claudia Reyes, a former classmate from my education program who had pivoted into family law after a nasty divorce of her own. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Are you sure you want to do this, Evie?" she asked after I gave her the outline. "Because once we start, there's no turning back." "I'm sure," I said, "but I don't want to destroy him. Not yet." She paused. "Not yet. I want him to see me rebuild," I said. "I want him to feel what it's like to be irrelevant." Claudia chuckled softly. "You've already won, Evelyn, but I'll help you make it official." When I returned home on Sunday evening, Greg was in the kitchen pouring himself a scotch, as if he hadn't just committed the most devastating betrayal of our marriage. He smiled when he saw me. "Hey, sweetheart, how was your weekend?" I stared at him, calm, composed, practiced. "It was enlightening," I said. He didn't ask questions. He never did. He had no idea I'd been to the beach house. No idea I'd been quietly gathering evidence. No idea that the woman he thought was fragile, dependent, and too naive to notice was now planning his undoing. That week, I played the role he expected, the loyal wife. I kissed him goodbye in the mornings, made dinner, even watched a movie with him on Friday night. He laughed. I smiled. He thought the danger had passed. But beneath that calm surface, I was shifting. I went through old bank statements, noting patterns. I called our accountant and requested full financial transparency on our joint assets. I changed the passwords on my personal accounts. I moved small sums of money into a private savings account I had opened. In my maiden name, it was all legal, all quiet. Greg noticed nothing until I stopped wearing my wedding ring. One morning, as I passed him the newspaper and his mug of black coffee, he looked at my bare hand. "Did you lose it?" he asked, gesturing at my missing ring. "No," I said, folding the napkin slowly. "I just don't wear things that don't mean anything anymore." His eyes flickered, but he said nothing, and that's when I knew. I had struck the first real crack. I didn't plan to see Cassandra that week, but fate, it seemed, had a flair for dramatic timing. On Wednesday morning, I ran into her at the farmer's market, the same one where we used to pick out peaches together every June. She looked radiant, dressed in her flowing linen dress, smiling as she leaned over a table of strawberries. I felt something twist in my gut, not rage, not grief, just the cold sting of recognition. This was the woman who had betrayed me with the man I trusted most. She didn't notice me at first. I could have walked away, pretended I hadn't seen her, but something in me wouldn't allow it. I walked up and said her name, Cassandra. She turned her smile already on her face. But it faltered when she saw me, just for a moment, then she caught herself. "Evie, oh my gosh, it's been weeks. I've missed you," she said, leaning in for a hug. I didn't move. Her arms froze mid-air before dropping back to her saidas. She laughed awkwardly. "Are you okay?" I looked her straight in the eyes. "I know." Her face went pale. The wind caught the edge of her scarf and whipped it over her shoulder like a signal flag. She blinked fast, her lips twitching like she wanted to form a denial, but there was none that would matter. "I'm not sure, don't," I interrupted. "Don't insult me with lies." There was a long silence. People bustled around us, none the wiser to the battlefield forming between two women surrounded by sunflowers and cinnamon rolls. Finally, she spoke. "It wasn't meant to happen like this." I laughed softly just once. "That line's getting tired." "We were both lonely," she said, eyes downcast now. "You had drifted. He needed someone, so you volunteered as tribute," I replied. She flinched. "Good. You were my best friend," I said, voice low and steady. "You could have come to me. You could have said anything, but instead you took the one thing you knew would cut me the deepest, and you did it in our home." I didn't mean to fall in love with him. "Love," I repeated. "You call it love. I didn't think he'd leave you." I stared at her, stunned. "So you were hoping he would?" That's when I saw it, the guilt, the shame, but also something worse, the flicker of regret that came not from what she did, but from how it was unraveling now. She hadn't been sorry. She was just sorry she got caught. "You can have him," I said, backing away, "but I promise you, whatever lies you built your little fantasy on, they're about to come crashing down." I left her standing there amidst the berries and baked goods, her perfect image cracking like a porcelain mask. Back home, I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I didn't even call Claudia. I just stood in the kitchen for a long time staring at the flowers Greg had sent me earlier that week. "Lilies, my favorite, or at least they used to be," the card said, "for the woman who makes everything in my life brighter." The audacity. That night, I opened the safe in our closet and pulled out the deed to the beach house. Greg had transferred it into both of our names after I begged him years ago. He thought it was just a gesture of love, but now it was leverage. The next day, I made an appointment with a realtor. "I'm thinking of selling," I said calmly. He looked over the property file. "It's a great time to list prime location, coastal markets, booming." "May I ask why now?" I smiled. "Let's just say I've finally decided it's time for a fresh start." By Friday, the papers were in motion. I didn't tell Greg, not yet, let him bask in the illusion a little longer. That weekend, I hosted our monthly neighborhood book club, a dozen women sipping rosé, chatting about the latest mystery novel, Greg, as always, made a brief appearance, charming as ever, flashing smiles, kissing cheeks, refilling glasses. No one would have guessed the war quietly raging beneath our home's surface. "Evie, you're glowing," one of the women said. "What's your secret letting go?" I said. "Of everything that no longer serves me," a few chuckled, not understanding the weight behind those words. Later that night, Greg slid into bed beside me, his hand brushing against my arm. "You were incredible tonight," he murmured. "They all adore you." "They don't know me," I replied. He laughed softly, confused. "What do you mean?" I turned to face him, my eyes searching his. "Tell me the truth, Greg. When you look at me, do you even recognize the woman lying beside you?" He blinked. "Of course I do." "Why would you?" "Because I don't recognize you anymore," I whispered. And then I turned away. Greg didn't answer me that night. He lay in the dark, quiet, shifting slightly every now and then, as if adjusting his weight might make my words go away. But they didn't. They hung there like smoke that wouldn't clear. The next morning I woke up before him. I had already packed an overnight bag and set a stack of signed documents neatly on the kitchen table. Property evaluations, beach house disclosures, and a realtor agreement. He wouldn't see them yet, but they were there like the blade of a guillotine waiting for the moment to drop. I drove to the beach house again. This time I wasn't sneaking in like a detective. This time it was mine. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the salty breeze rushing past me like an old friend warning me to tread carefully. The house still held their shadows. The unmade bed, a pair of earrings on the nightstand that weren't mine, the faint scent of her perfume clinging to the walls like mildew. But I wasn't here to mourn anymore. I was here to reclaim. I walked through each room, slowly photographing everything, just in case Greg tried to contest the state of the property. The realtor would be coming by in a few hours, but I wanted to make sure the space reflected my new story, not the one they'd tainted. I stripped the bed and tossed the linens in the wash. I opened all the windows. I lit candles, jasmine, vanilla, cedar, my scents. Not hers. I was erasing them with every gesture. As I was setting a fresh vase of flowers on the dining table, I noticed something tucked beneath one of the chair cushions. A bracelet. Not just any bracelet. The silver charm bracelet I had given Cassandra for her 50th birthday. The one she had cried over, said, reminded her of the summers we spent together as teens. It had her initials engraved on the back. How poetic she had left it behind in her lover's nest, never imagining that I would be the one clearing out the cobwebs. I placed it in a Ziploc bag and labeled it Evidence. Then I tucked it into my purse. The realtor arrived shortly after. Her name was Ruby, a fierce woman in her early 40s with a sharp bob haircut and sharper instincts. She took one look at me and smiled. "You ready to let go?" she asked. "I already have," I said. We walked through the house together as she snapped photos and made notes. "It's a beautiful space," she said. "You could fetch a good offer quickly, especially in this market." "Let's price it to move," I said. "It's time this house had a new story." Ruby raised an eyebrow but didn't press. She had the sense not to ask questions when the energy in the room was vibrating with unspoken truths. As she was leaving, she paused at the door. "If this was yours and your husband's shared property, just be ready for questions," she said carefully. "Oh," I replied, "I'm more than ready for those." By Sunday, the listing was live. The headline was clear: Private Coastal Gem, Motivated Seller. That evening, I cooked dinner: roasted chicken, lemon, asparagus, garlic, mashed potatoes. Greg's favorite. I wanted him relaxed, comfortable, unprepared. We ate mostly in silence, the clinking of cutlery, the only conversation afterward. I poured him a glass of wine, then set my phone face up on the table. He noticed the screen lit up, a message from Ruby, showing scheduled for Wednesday morning. 3 interested buyers so far. Greg blinked. "Ruby? Who's Ruby?" "Our realtor," I said, not looking up. He sat back in his chair. "Realtor for what?" I took a slow sip of my wine before answering. "For the beach house." Silence. "Then excuse me, I'm selling it," I said simply. "The papers are on the table. You should read them." He stood up, jaw clenched. "You're not serious." "Oh, I'm very serious. That house is half mine," I interrupted, "and I'm done letting it rot with ghosts and lipstick-stained wine glasses." He slammed his hand on the table, making the wine ripple in the glass. "You don't get to make decisions like this without me." I stood slowly, deliberately, "and you don't get to betray me and expect that I'll keep decorating the stage for your affairs." He stared at me red-faced, trying to summon the version of me who would apologize for upsetting him. She didn't show up. "You've lost control, Greg," I said softly. "You just haven't realized it yet." He stormed out, muttering something under his breath, and I didn't follow. I cleaned up the table, loaded the dishwasher, and poured myself another glass of wine. When I returned to the living room, my phone buzzed again. It was Cassandra. "We need to talk." I stared at the message, letting it sit there like spoiled fruit. "No, you need to talk. I need to live." I turned off my phone and sat down on the couch, the sound of waves crashing in the distance, real or imagined, filling the room like a lullaby for the woman I used to be. Cassandra didn't call the next day. She didn't text again either. Maybe she was hoping her vague message, "We need to talk," would be enough to pull me into the old dance of reconciliation, to meet her under the pretense of closure or friendship or guilt. But I wasn't her Evelyn anymore, that Evelyn. The one who would have rushed to meet her in a cafe with watery eyes and trembling hands was gone. Instead, I went for a walk, a long one. I took the trail near the marshland behind our neighborhood, where the tall grass whispered in the wind and birds sang like they had no knowledge of human betrayal. With every step, I imagined shedding pieces of the past, her laughter echoing in my kitchen, her perfume lingering on Greg's collar, her voice in my voicemail like a ghost pretending to be alive. I didn't delete the message, but I didn't answer it either. When I got home, Greg was in his study with the door shut. I heard the low murmur of his voice, the tense pauses, the sharp edge to his tone. He was on the phone with someone, and whoever it was, he wasn't winning the conversation. He came out an hour later looking exhausted and pale. He saw me standing by the kitchen sink and cleared his throat. "You sold the beach house behind my back." I didn't answer. He took a step closer. "That's where I go to think, Evelyn." I turned slowly. "Think. Is that what you two were doing between the sheets?" He looked away, and I saw the sting in his eyes. "Good. Let it sting. Let it burrow," I said. "I was sorry," he muttered. "You said it like it was a formality, like you were paying a parking ticket." He rubbed his forehead. "I never meant for any of this to happen." I walked toward him. "Greg, let me make something perfectly clear. You meant for all of it to happen. Every touch, every lie, every weekend. What you didn't mean was for me to find out, and that's what you're really sorry for." His expression broke for a second, just enough to confirm everything I already knew. It was never remorse. It was panic. "Where do we go from here?" he asked quietly. "We," I repeated. "There is no we anymore, Greg. There's just you and there's me, and I'm finally okay with that." He sat down at the table, defeated. I stood in the doorway watching him, a man unraveling, a man who had spent years believing he was untouchable. "I'll contest the house," he said softly. "The sale, I'll get an injunction." I crossed my arms. "You're welcome to try." There was a time when that threat would have frightened me, when I would have begged him not to do something rash, to remember the life we built. Now I almost hoped he did contest it. I wanted him to throw everything he had into it because I had more than receipts. Now I had momentum. I had fury that had been folded and pressed for decades under dinner table etiquette and wedding anniversary toasts, and I had Claudia. I sent her a voice message that night with an update on Greg's attempt to block the sale. Her reply was swift. "Let him try. We'll bury him in paperwork." Later that evening, I walked into the guest bedroom, the one I'd quietly claimed for myself a week ago, and pulled out a black box from the top shelf of my closet. It contained old letters, faded photographs, and a journal I hadn't opened since our 25th anniversary trip to Paris. In it, I had written pages and pages about how in love I was, how safe I felt, how lucky. I tore out every page and burned them in the fireplace. because that woman hadn't been lucky. She had been lied to, diminished, replaced. But not anymore. I thought of my children next. How much or how little they knew. Our daughter Isabel was the most intuitive. She had called me last week, her voice hesitant. "Mom, you sound different. Is everything okay? I'm just remembering who I am." I had told her, and it's a lot to process. She had been quiet for a moment, then said something that stopped me cold. "I'm proud of you, not for keeping a family together, not for enduring, but for reclaiming. I wasn't going to keep this illusion alive for them anymore. They were grown. They deserved to know the truth, not because I wanted them to pick sides, but because I wanted them to understand what strength really looked like." The next day, I scheduled a family dinner. All three of them, no spouses, no grandchildren, just us. Greg was surprised when I told him, "What's this about?" he asked. "Family," I said, "and truth." Sunday evening arrived heavy with anticipation. I stood in the kitchen chopping vegetables like I was diffusing landmines. The roast was in the oven. The table set simply but elegantly. Linen napkins, white plates, a single candle flickering in the center. This dinner wasn't about theatrics, it was about clarity. One by one our children arrived. Isabel was first dressed in soft blue and holding a bottle of wine. She kissed my cheek and studied my face closely. I could tell she already sensed something deeper than just a casual meal. Then came Daniel, our oldest, ever the peacemaker. He smiled warmly, gave me a tight hug, and asked if Greg was home yet. "No," I replied. "He'll be here soon." Finally, Ethan stumbled in late, as always, tie crooked phone in one hand, apology on his lips. Sorry, traffic was murder, smells amazing, though." I laughed, genuine, small, fleeting. "Glad you made it." We sat around the table, the smell of rosemary and garlic filling the room. There were a few minutes of easy conversation updates on work stories about Isabel's toddler throwing spaghetti at the ceiling, the usual chorus of small talk. And then the front door opened. Greg walked in trying to wear the old version of himself, the confident father, the head of the table, the man with all the answers. But something about him was off. His shoulders slumped slightly, and there was a cautiousness in his step. He kissed Isabel's cheek, patted the boys on the back, then sat down beside me. Dinner began. For a few minutes we all played the part, passing dishes, laughing politely. But every smile I gave was paper thin, every nod rehearsed. My heart was beating so loudly in my chest, I was sure someone would notice. And then I set my fork down. "I invited you here," I began, "because there's something I need to tell you, something I've needed to say for a long time." Greg looked up, his expression tightening. Daniel leaned forward. "Mom, what is it?" I looked at them, these three people I had carried, raised, loved with every fiber of my being, and I realized this wasn't just about me. It was about freeing all of us from the lie we had been living. "Your father has been unfaithful," I said, my voice even clear. "Not once. Not with one mistake, but repeatedly. And not just with strangers, but with someone I trusted more than anyone else." Isabel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ethan blinked, stunned. Daniel looked at Greg. "Is this true?" he asked. Greg shifted in his seat. "It's not as simple as it is," I cut in. "It's exactly as simple as it sounds." He looked down at his plate. "Cassandra?" Isabel asked softly. I nodded. "She was like an aunt to us," Ethan muttered. "You said she was your best friend." "She was," I said. "And she betrayed me just like your father did." Silence. Greg finally spoke, his voice low. "I made mistakes, terrible ones, and I've apologized. But this, airing it out like this, Evie, it's not fair to them." "Not fair?" Isabel snapped, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "You cheated on Mom with her best friend. And you want to talk about fairness, Dad?" Daniel said, eyes hard now. "This isn't just about you and Mom. This affects us, everything we believed about our family." Greg tried to defend himself, to explain, but his words were broken things, fragments of justification and guilt that couldn't hold weight anymore. "I didn't want to drag you into this," I told them. But I also couldn't keep pretending that our family was whole. I needed you to know the truth because I'm not going to carry it alone anymore. Ethan rubbed his face with both hands. Jesus. I stood up and walked to the side table, retrieving the envelope. I placed it in front of Greg. These are the finalized sale documents for the beach house. It's gone. He stared at it like it might catch fire. I thought you loved that house, he murmured. I did. I said, but not anymore. It was ours, then it was yours. Now it belongs to strangers like it should. Isabel stood up too. She walked around the table and hugged me long and tight. I'm proud of you, she whispered again. The boys followed, each offering quiet comfort. Greg didn't move. When the dinner ended and they all filtered out with solemn hugs and promises to call soon, Greg remained at the table, swirling his untouched wine. You humiliated me, he said bitterly once we were alone. No, I said. You did that to yourself. I just told the truth. You think this is justice. I think it's a beginning. He stared at me, searching for something: remorse, pity, vulnerability. But all he saw was resolve. I don't know who you are anymore, he said. I gave him a soft smile. Then it's time you met me. Greg moved out 2 weeks later. It wasn't a dramatic affair. No shouting, no tears, no broken dishes. He packed a few boxes, arranged for a moving van, and left a note on the kitchen counter that simply said, I'll forward the mail. That was it. Decades of marriage reduced to logistics. I stood in the living room after he left, staring at the empty spaces where his books had been, where his armchair used to sit, where his cologne once lingered in the air. There was no joy in his absence, but there was space, and space meant something I hadn't had in a long time: the room to rebuild. The silence was deafening at first. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to hear his footsteps or the soft creak of the floor outside the bedroom. I'd walk past his study and pause instinctively, waiting to hear the click of his keyboard. But there was nothing. And after a while, nothing began to feel like peace. I redecorated, not with the wild strokes of someone trying to erase the past, but with the quiet intention of someone reclaiming a home. I painted the walls. I replaced the sofa. I gave his study a new name: my office. It wasn't just the house that changed. I did too. I started wearing colors again, vivid reds and deep forest greens. I joined a yoga class. I even signed up for a local writing workshop on Saturday mornings, where I met people who didn't know me as Greg's wife, but as Evelyn, the woman who wrote haunting short stories about heartbreak and memory and survival. There, I met a woman named Celeste. She had been through something similar: betrayal, divorce, the painful art of starting over. We began meeting for coffee after class, our conversations flowing like old friends. It was the first time in years I felt seen, not for the role I played in someone else's life, but for who I really was. One Saturday, over almond croissants and cappuccinos, she asked the question no one else had dared: do you still love him? I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window instead, watching the leaves dance in the wind. I loved what I thought we had, I finally said. And maybe I loved the version of me that existed inside that illusion. But no, not anymore. Celeste nodded. That's brave. No, I said with a soft smile, it's just overdue. Back at home, I continued sorting through the remnants of a life once shared: old photos, anniversary cards, notes, scrawled on napkins from restaurants we'd loved. I kept the ones that meant something, not because I wanted to remember him, but because I wanted to remember me in those moments. The woman I had been before, everything shattered. One evening, while sorting through a storage box in the garage, I found a sealed envelope marked private in Greg's handwriting. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity is a force hard to silence. Inside were letters, not to me. To her, dozens of them, written in ink, folded carefully, bound by a thin blue ribbon. Some were romantic, others were desperate. One in particular made my hands tremble. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Evie's getting suspicious, but I can't give you up. I won't. So it had never been accidental. It had never been a single moment of weakness or a one-time mistake. It had been calculated, hidden, fed like a fire over years. And still I felt no rage, just the cold breath of finality. I placed the letters in a box, sealed it and labeled it, "Return to sender." The next morning I left it on Greg's apartment doorstep and walked away without looking back. A week later he texted me, "Greg, got your delivery." Was that supposed to hurt me? It was supposed to remind you I don't owe you silence anymore. He didn't reply. A few days later, a bouquet of lilies arrived on my doorstep. No note. I threw them in the trash. I had spent too long giving beauty and meaning to things that didn't deserve them. I was done attaching value to gestures that cost nothing, but bought control. The next morning I woke up early, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat on the porch. As the sun rose, I watched the light stretch across the sky, soft and golden, painting the world in possibility. I thought of my children, of how strong they had been when I told them the truth. Isabel had called the next day just to check in. Daniel had stopped by with groceries. Ethan, for all his chaos, had texted me every night since. We were a different kind of family now, not perfect, not whole in the way we used to be, but honest. And that mattered more than anything. My phone buzzed. It was Celeste Gallery exhibit downtown this Friday. Wanna go? Me, absolutely, because now my life was filling with new things, new people, new stories, the past. It would always be there, tucked into corners and memories and the spaces I couldn't repaint. But it didn't own me anymore. Friday night came, and I stood in front of my closet for 10 full minutes, not because I had nothing to wear, but because I had too many choices that felt like old versions of me. The tidy beige cardigans, the floral blouses Greg used to compliment because they were modest and elegant. The sensible heels. I closed the door. Then I reached for something I hadn't worn in years, a deep crimson wrap dress, soft against my skin, the kind that whispered power without shouting. I paired it with black boots and a long coat. No pearls, no apology. The gallery was in the heart of downtown, tucked between a jazz bar and a bookstore that always smelled like cinnamon. Celeste was waiting for me at the entrance, holding 2 tickets and smiling like she'd known I'd show up dressed like a revolution. "You look incredible," she said. "I feel different." "Good. That means you're doing it right." The exhibit was titled Ashes and Artifacts, a collection curated by women who had survived betrayals and heartbreaks and rebuilt their lives through sculpture, painting, and photography. Each piece held stories beneath the brushstrokes, some raw, others quiet, all honest. There was one piece that stopped me completely. A shattered mirror suspended in a wooden frame made from salvaged shipwrecked timber. Etched into the wood was a single line I didn't break. I transformed. I stood there for a long time. Something about the way the light caught the jagged shards, reflecting 100 fragmented faces, struck me hard. I didn't see a broken woman in the glass. I saw someone still emerging. Celeste came to stand beside me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" "It is," I whispered. We had coffee after the exhibit, sitting at a small cafe with candles in mason jars and music that sounded like rain falling on leaves. "I've been thinking about writing it all down," I told her. "Your story," I nodded. "Not to publish, not to shame anyone, just for me to make sense of it." She smiled, warm and understanding. "That's the best reason to write anything." We talked for hours about grief, forgiveness, rage, the strange quiet that settles in after the storm ends. She walked me to my car, and just before we said goodnight, she touched my arm. "You're doing something most people never get to do," she said. "You're waking up to your own life." It echoed in my chest long after I drove home. That night, I didn't dream about Greg or Cassandra or the house by the shore. I dreamed about fireflies in a field, a child laughing, a woman dancing barefoot in the rain. When I woke, I felt lighter. That morning, I sat down at my desk, and opened a new journal, not the one filled with bitterness and betrayal. A new one, clean pages, crisp spine. I titled the first page after the silence. I wrote about the mirror, the exhibit, the moment I realized I was no longer trying to heal so I could return to the woman I once was, but so I could become someone new. I wrote about the strength it takes to choose yourself, and I didn't stop writing for hours. Later that week, a call came in from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something nudged me to pick up. It was Cassandra's husband, Evelyn. He asked, his voice stiff but calm. "I'm sorry to call you like this, but I thought you should know." Cassandra left. I was silent. She took a job out west, packed up yesterday and didn't leave a forwarding address. Just a note. I waited. He continued. "I found some things. Letters, notes. I guess I always knew deep down something wasn't right. But you never expect it to come from the people closest to you." "No," I said. "You don't." He sighed. "I hope you're doing okay." "I am," I said, and I meant it. "Good. You deserve that." After the call ended, I sat quietly thinking not of Cassandra, but of all the women like her, the ones who insert themselves into someone else's world, like Ivy, beautiful, familiar, but choking everything underneath. I didn't hate her, not anymore. I just didn't care, and that I realized was real power. Later that day, I walked to the mailbox and found a letter addressed to me in Greg's handwriting, just one page. "Evelyn, I won't ask you to forgive me. I won't pretend I understand what I destroyed until it was too late. I've lost more than just you. I've lost myself. But I hope one day you'll remember the man I was before I became someone else." I folded the letter and placed it in the same box where I kept my writing journals, not out of sentiment, out of closure, because I would remember him. I would remember everything, but I wouldn't carry it. Spring came early that year. It arrived not with a loud announcement, but with small kindnesses from the earth. Buds on the dogwood trees, the return of birdsong in the mornings, the way sunlight warmed the kitchen tiles like a soft hand on my shoulder. It had been nearly 4 months since Greg left, and 3 months since I'd last seen or heard from him. I didn't mark the time with bitterness. I marked it by the things I began doing for myself, things I had shelved for years in favor of his schedule, his business dinners, his world. I signed up for a painting class on Thursday nights. I started volunteering at a women's shelter on weekends. I read novels again, long ones, the kind I used to tell myself I didn't have time for. And every Saturday morning I went to the cafe with Celeste. Sometimes we talked about grief, sometimes about nonsense, but there was a kind of holy silence between us now, the kind you can only share with someone who's seen you fall apart and still sees beauty in the pieces. One afternoon, I walked into the local community center where a photography exhibit was being set up for a charity auction. The organizer, an older man named Victor with kind eyes and a voice like honey, was struggling to hang a frame straight. Here I offered, taking the opposite end. "You need a better grip," he smiled. "Are you volunteering or just someone with a good eye?" "Maybe both," I said. He chuckled, and before I knew it, I was helping set up the rest of the gallery. We talked the whole time. He told me about his late wife, how he'd started organizing events to honor her memory. I told him about the writing class, the yoga group, and the beach house I'd sold. Like shedding a worn-out skin when the exhibit opened the next evening, I stood beside Victor as people filtered in and out, commenting on the black and white portraits and the raw, candid honesty of each shot. There was one photograph that caught my attention, a woman probably in her 50s, standing ankle-deep in the ocean, with her back to the camera, dress blowing in the wind. There was power in her posture, a kind of defiant grace. Victor caught me staring. "That one's called Choosing the Shore." "It was the artist's turning point," she said. "The day she stopped trying to be rescued," I smiled. "She doesn't look like someone waiting for anything." "No," he said, "she doesn't." That night, Victor walked me to my car. He didn't ask for my number. He didn't hint at coffee or lunch or a follow-up. He just said, "You've got light in your eyes. Keep protecting it." And that was the most beautiful thing anyone had said to me in years. A week later, Isabel invited me over for dinner. She made homemade pasta, lit candles, even played the jazz. I used to hum when she was a little girl. Halfway through dessert, she set her fork down and said, "Mom, you seem different." I laughed. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" "A real thing," she said. "I was scared when you told us not of losing Dad, but of losing you." Her voice trembled just slightly. "I didn't lose you," she added. You found yourself, and honestly, it's inspiring. I reached across the table and held her hand. I'm not who I was, but I'm still your mother. That part hasn't changed. No, she said, squeezing my hand. It's only gotten stronger. When I got home that evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders and a warm cup of tea in my hands. The stars were out. I hadn't looked at them in so long. I remembered how Greg used to point them out to the kids, turning every constellation into a bedtime story, and I let the memory exist. Just the no bitterness, no longing, just a chapter closed. The next morning I received a letter in the mail, handwritten, no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Cassandra. I held it for a while before opening it, not because I feared the contents, but because I needed to make sure I read it as the woman I am now, not the woman who once waited for her best friend's calls like lifelines. Evelyn, I know I don't deserve your attention, let alone your forgiveness. I made a choice I can't take back, and it cost me everything. My marriage, my home, my sense of who I am. I've been in California for a while now. I thought distance might erase the ache, but it doesn't. I miss you. Not because I want to repair what's broken, because I know some things can't be repaired, but because I want you to know I never stopped admiring you, even when I envied you, even when I betrayed you. You were always the one with the stronger heart, and now I see that even more clearly. Whatever you decide, thank you, Cass. I folded the letter slowly, set it aside, and poured myself another cup of tea. It didn't sting, it didn't soothe, it simply was, and that I realized was healing. The letter from Cassandra stayed on my desk for days, unread again. Even after I'd opened it, I didn't respond. Not because I hadn't processed it, I had, but because some things don't need a reply. Some stories simply close with silence. The kind of silence that doesn't echo pain anymore, just peace. It was mid-April when I finally stepped back into the beach town. Not the house, of course. That was long gone, sold to a young couple who planned to turn it into a summer rental. I didn't even drive past it. I had no desire to see what they had done with the place. Instead, I went to the shore. The beach was quiet that morning, pale sunlight spilling onto the sand like melted gold. The water was calm, the wind kind. I walked barefoot, letting the cold water bite at my ankles. Each step felt like a cleansing, like I was shedding every old version of myself, every version that had smiled through discomfort, stayed silent for peace, loved blindly and loyally. I paused when I reached the jetty, the same one where Greg and I had once sat with picnic baskets, feeding grapes to each other and laughing like teenagers. The memory came, then left. That's how I knew I was ready. I sat on a smooth rock and pulled out my journal. Not the old one full of accounts and betrayal. The new one I wrote, "Today I didn't remember him. Today I remembered myself," and then I closed the journal and let the ocean speak. That afternoon I met with Victor again at a modest little wine bar tucked behind the bookstore. He'd invited me to help with another event, a storytelling evening at the community center. The theme was resilience. And for the first time I said yes, without hesitation. "You thinking of speaking?" he asked as we clinked glasses. "I might," I said, "but not as the woman who was cheated on. I want to speak as the woman who chose not to disappear." He nodded. "That's the only kind of story worth telling." We spent the evening talking about art life and the long road back to yourself. At one point, Victor looked at me with something like admiration, maybe more. But he didn't push. He didn't try to fill the space Greg left behind. He respected it. That, more than anything, was what I needed. 1 week later, I stood in front of a small crowd at the community center reading a piece I'd written. Just for the night, my hands didn't shake. My voice didn't falter. I spoke about letting go, about how betrayal breaks you, not in one clean line, but in 1,000 quiet ways, and how healing isn't one grand moment of triumph. It's 1,000 small choices, choosing to wake up, to breathe, to stand, to not text him back, to not remember her birthday, to walk into the world as if it belongs to you, because it does. After I finished, the room was silent, not heavy, full. Someone clapped, then someone else. Then the whole room, not because I had told a perfect story, but because I had told the truth. Victor met me after the event. He didn't say anything at first. He just gave me a warm hug. "You've got fire in you," he said into my hair. "Don't let anyone put it out again." I smiled. "I won't." Later that night, I found myself driving down a quiet street I hadn't been on in years, the one where Greg and I first lived after we were married. The apartment complex was still there, though. The sign had been replaced. I parked the car and sat for a while watching as a young couple walked out, holding hands, laughing about something neither of them would remember tomorrow. I didn't cry. Instead, I whispered, "I hope you both protect this, because love is fragile, and so is trust. And when someone gives you both, the least you can do is hold them gently." Back home, I took off my boots, changed into soft pajamas, and made myself a cup of chamomile tea. The kitchen was quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. I thought about Greg. I wondered if he still looked for glimpses of the life he once had, if he ever regretted trading it all for fleeting affection and the illusion of freedom. But those were his consequences to live with, not mine. I had built something new, something real, a life where I was no longer waiting to be chosen, but choosing myself every single day. May brought more than warm breezes and blooming magnolias. It brought clarity. I could feel it in the rhythm of my days. Life no longer felt like something I was surviving. I was living, breathing differently, even walking differently. I caught my reflection in the window one afternoon and didn't recognize the woman looking back, not because she was unfamiliar, but because for the first time in years, she wasn't fading. She was solid, intentional, awake, and smiling. One Saturday, Celeste surprised me with a printed invitation. "You've been formally summoned," she said with a smirk. "To what?" She tapped the envelope. "A gallery showing, but not just any. Victor submitted your journal excerpt, the one you read at the storytelling night, to a mixed media exhibit, and it was chosen." I blinked. "What, you're going to be featured?" she said, squeezing my hand. "Your words, your voice, and I get to stand next to you and beam like a proud big sister?" I laughed, stunned, flattered, and if I was honest, terrified, but also ready. The night of the exhibit, I wore the same crimson dress from that first gallery evening, not because I needed it to feel powerful, but because I had grown into it, owned it. It was no longer armor, it was celebration. The exhibit was called Stories We Survive. Writers, painters, sculptors, and photographers came together to showcase the ways pain, loss, and healing manifest through art. My journal excerpt had been paired with a black and white photograph of a lone woman standing at the edge of a dock, looking out over the water. The caption beneath the image read, "I didn't heal to go back. I healed so I could move forward without needing to explain myself." Dozens of people stopped to read it. Some whispered, a few nodded slowly. One woman wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. And as I stood nearby watching them absorb my story, without even knowing it was mine, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pride. Not revenge, not closure, pride. Victor found me later holding 2 glasses of wine. "You're the woman in the photograph," he said softly. I smiled. I didn't even know it until now. "Funny how that works," he replied. "Sometimes we have to become the story before we understand it." We walked together for a while, then found a quiet table in the courtyard strung with fairy lights. The air was cool, scented with citrus and promise. "You've changed," he said, not as a statement of curiosity, but admiration. "I've returned," I corrected, "to the person I should have been all along." He nodded. "What do you want now?" I considered the question. Not what did I want to escape, not what did I want to fix, but what did I want to create? I want mornings where I don't feel like I owe anyone an apology for being happy. I want late nights filled with stories and laughter. I want art on my walls and books on every surface. I want quiet when I choose it, and noise when I crave it. And maybe, I added, I want to share it all with someone who understands the value of every piece. Victor didn't speak right away. He didn't rush to fill the air with promises or flattery. He just reached out and touched my hand. No pressure, no expectation, just presence. The next morning I walked to the market for fresh bread and tulips, two things I'd once considered indulgent but now understood were little acts of worship to the self. On the way back, I passed a bookstore with a display titled Second Acts, Stories of Women Who Rebuilt. I stepped inside. One of the authors, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and a voice like velvet, was giving a talk about reclaiming life after abandonment. Her words flowed with truth, not performance. She spoke of betrayal, but not as a wound, rather as a doorway. It doesn't matter who broke you, she said. What matters is who you become once you realize you are allowed to rebuild differently. Brighter, bolder, on your terms. I bought her book and had her sign it. When she asked my name, I said, Evelyn Monroe. Her pen paused for just a second. Strong name, she said. You wear it well. When I got home, I placed the book on my nightstand and opened my laptop. I began typing the first chapter of my memoir, not for publishers, not for pity, but for the girl I used to be, the woman who needed someone to whisper, you will not stay broken, not if you choose differently. That night, as I brushed my teeth and turned off the lights, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. Just wanted to say, I've been thinking about everything you've done, Mom. I never said it clearly enough, but you're a damn hero. We see you now, really see you, and I think Dad does too, even if he'll never say it. I sat in the dark for a while, tears welling, not from sadness but from release, because I had spent years screaming into silence. And now, finally, someone had heard me, a year to the day. After Greg walked out of our home, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, not to mourn, not to reflect on pain, but to witness the woman I had become. There were fine lines around my eyes now, but they didn't feel like signs of aging. They felt like proof that I had laughed, cried, fought, survived, that I had lived through something not in spite of it, but because of it. I had planned nothing extravagant to mark the date, no symbolic release of balloons, no dramatic closure ceremony, just a quiet cup of coffee, a familiar playlist, and the breeze coming through the open window like an old friend checking in. I was no longer waiting for some grand external sign to tell me I was healed. The proof was already everywhere. It was in the book deal I'd just signed with a small but passionate independent publisher, Ashes and Artifacts Essays on Love Loss and Starting Over. A collection of writings inspired by the exhibit, the sea, and everything in between. It was in the laughter that came more easily now in my new habit of dancing while I cooked, even if the radio played out of tune. And yes, it was even in the stillness, those moments when I would sit with a cup of tea, stare out at the quiet, and feel content. Not happy in a performative way, not fine in the way I used to say just to keep the peace, but deeply, undeniably content. That morning, Isabel called Mom. She said, "You've come so far." "I have," I replied, sipping my tea, "and I'm proud of it." She hesitated for a moment, then asked gently, "Do you ever miss him?" I smiled, not out of denial, but clarity. I missed the version of me that didn't know how strong I could be. But him, I said, no, I think he was just part of the path that led me here. She let out a long breath. "You really are different now. I'm more me than I've ever been." Later that afternoon, I visited the mural wall we'd painted at the community center. Each woman in our group had added something personal, a color, a quote, a symbol of what they had reclaimed. My addition was small, a single line of white script across a deep ocean blue background. She stayed with herself when no one else did. That was my truth. Not just surviving betrayal, not just divorcing a man who had taken my love and used it up, but staying with myself. When everything around me had tried to convince me to shrink, I stayed. That evening, I met Celeste at the cafe. We didn't talk about Greg. We didn't talk about Cassandra. We talked about the retreat we were planning together, women who rewrite a weekend of writing, painting, and shared strength. She reached across the table, took my hand, and said, "You know, I think you've become the person I would have wanted to look up to 10 years ago." I didn't cry, but I felt it deep in my chest. That quiet click of things falling into place. And when Victor showed up joining us with his usual kindness and calm presence, I noticed the way he looked at me not as someone broken or wounded, but as someone whole. "I hope you know," he said. "As we walked to our cars, your story helped more people than you realize." I paused before unlocking my door. I didn't tell it to help anyone. I said I told it because it was mine, and I refused to let it stay buried. "You're a lighthouse, Evelyn," he said quietly. "Not because you shine brighter than others, but because you turned your wreckage into light." I stood there a moment longer after he left, hand still on the car door. A lighthouse. Yes, that felt right. Not immune to the storms, but standing anyway. Back home, I curled up in bed with a novel in my journal, the final pages nearly full. Before turning out the light, I opened it and wrote my final entry. On the last page, I was a woman who gave everything and still wasn't enough for the man I loved. I was a woman who was betrayed, not once but countless times. I was a woman who fell apart quietly, invisibly. But now I am the woman who stood back up. I am the woman who stayed with herself. I am the woman who walks into the world without fear, and I will never disappear again. I closed the book, turned off the light, and slept through the night without waking once.